All right, we're going to be looking at Unit 0, Research Methods. It's the first one for AP Psychology, so this is going over different types of research, the statistics behind that research, as well as the ethical laws that we're going to be talking about, as well as identifying the different perspectives of psychology. So without further ado, let's kind of get started looking into these slides. So first things first, we talking about the origins of psychology. So the biggest thing you need to know about this is psychology itself is a study of our behavior and our mental processes. What that means is it's looking at our thoughts, feelings, and emotions on the mental side, but also things we can observe with the behavior side. So things that we might notice people doing or the lack thereof, meaning that maybe they're not being very social or something, for example, and they're lacking some behavior that you would expect in a certain situation, like a party, for example. So we look into that in psychology. These will not be on the exam this week, but we talk a little bit about Aristotle, kind of diving into some of those first kind of ideas of psychology. We talk about dualism, and then Wilhelm Wundt, who made the first psychology lab. So there's 6 major types of psychology kind of perspectives, and these are kind of the biggest ones that you'll see on the AP exam. So first things first is the biological one. The biological perspective focuses on everything in psychology being about your body and the biological processes of that. So things such as your brain lobes impacting your emotions and thoughts, your nervous system reacting to stress, or neurotransmitters causing different moods and emotions. Everything that makes our life what it is, our perception of it, is based on our functions of our body. That's biological. Here's another one that I didn't label here, but it's evolutionary. Now, evolutionary perspective is the idea that we carry traits of survival, on and on through our offspring. So something that will help us survive will be, given off to our kids via genetics, and then they would have that kind of gene or that type of trait that's passed on. So that's something that could pop up in the exam, but these are the major 6 I want to kind of go over today. Number 2 is cognitive. That focuses on our thoughts and types of memories. So, for example, things such as our feelings, going back to memories that we had, emotions, fears and ideas and anxieties, anything that's inside our brain, the thought process, that is cognitive psychology. So they focus more on our actual thoughts and the meaning behind them. Behaviorism, this type of perspective focuses on our actions as well as how we learn behavior. We model others, we learn from observations, we're conditioned with rewards and punishments. Everything is about what we do and our actions. We don't really care for behaviorism about our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. They just look at the actual behavior that we see, the actual actions that someone or something is doing or not doing. Social psychology perspective just talks about how we're influenced by others and the impact that they have with our interactions. So things like, are we obedient to others? How are we influenced, like peer pressure wise, stereotypes, anything that involves us interacting with different groups and cultures. Humanistic psychology focuses not on solving a lot of problems, but more about us growing as a person and reaching our full potential. I think of this one as like a flower or cropped, where like over time it slowly grows and strengthens and kind of gets better and better until it blossoms into like the full flower or plant. Same thing with humanistic psychology. Respect and listening, caring about the person, being non-judging, allows people to nourish themselves and grow and get through different difficulties in life. Psychoanalysis, which is also called psychodynamic as well in psychology, this is our suppressed anxieties and our unconscious thoughts. So things that we kind of push down and not try to think about on the everyday. So things like dream interpretation, suppressed fears and trauma, and more. So these are the big 6 that you need to know for the AP exam. They're all going to be on there as multiple choice, or sometimes it's open-ended questions on the EBQ. These are all things that you need to make sure that you lock in, especially for that AP exam. Going into research types, there's 2 major types of research findings. You have qualitative, which is the quality of our experiences. So things such as photos, maps, interviews, and stories, things that like have meaning and impact, but we can't put it on like a number. These are just things that you have to experience to feel the weight and gravity of. Now, quantitative is a way to look at things in a number form, a numerical basis of data. Things like test scores, a timer, using a ruler for measurements. These are all examples of quantitative. Think of quantity. Now, this is a super important term that you should know for the AP exam, which is operational definition. This is basically how we're measuring something quantitatively in a study. So it's almost like a step-by-step specific process of how they're measuring something in the research or study. So, for example, if they're basically doing measurements or a study on depression, that can be measured through something such as like a SAD study or a SAD exam. So the scores of that will show us as a number how depressed somebody is. If the number is high, they're extremely depressed. If the number is low, they're not that depressed at all. All right, so there's a couple examples right there as we move on at this time to the types of research. We have many different types of research, the first one being experimental. We're looking for true or falseness, which is also called falsifiability. We're trying to make an educated guess or prediction on something, and we want to test it out to see if it's true or not. We're looking for cause and effect here. So we're actually trying to do an experiment, a study where we have some control and manipulation, and we want to see if our guess, our prediction, can be proven correct or not. So experimental is all about manipulating and going into a yes or no response of data. So for example, maybe you're seeing if vitamin D helps with anxiety levels, and you notice through administering vitamin D, for example, that people do feel better. That could be a cause and effect showing that this has helped them, this type of vitamin, for example. Correlational is similar, but not the exact same. You're looking at two variables and looking for relationships, but it does not prove causation. We're kind of just collecting data and observing. So for example, we might see people who study more get better test scores. So that's good. We might see a relationship or a common trend, but that doesn't guarantee it. Somebody could study all night and have a horrible morning and flunk that exam still. We usually see that in two ways. Scatter plots, which is a kind of a graph version that shows us upward trends, which are positives, negative trends, which go down, or none. If we don't want to see it as a graph, we could do what's called a correlational coefficient, which is the number version. Typically, it's a number between -1 and 1. Now, naturalistic observation, this is when we are observing someone or something undetected in their environment. So, for example, it could be an animal in the wild. It could be somebody in class. It could be somebody in public. We're observing without them noticing they've been observed, which helps them basically have their basic normal behavior and interactions. We're not influencing them in any way. Longitudinal studies, these are studies that have the same group over a long extended period of time. They might follow twins for 10, 15 years and constantly check on them every year for changes of personality or things of such. These are basically studies that take a long, which is in the name, period of time to do with the same people. Cross-sectional is a lot different. This is when we look at trends over different ages at one moment in time. So it could be like movie trends, it could be their views on certain things and like the culture or the climate that we're in, in the country, etc. Case studies are an in-depth study of extreme detail, so looking at every interview, recordings, images, drawings, photos, interviewing people who are witnesses of something. That's a case study. Meta-analysis is when we take a bunch of data that's out there from different studies on a topic that we're looking at. We're observing them and reviewing all this data that people did, all their experiments, and we're coming up with one single common answer. So it's almost like we're playing investigation. We're trying to look at all these different results and see if they all agree on something. That's meta-analysis. So this just kind of shows cross-sectional versus longitudinal. So for this, you can see that at one moment in time, we have this type of group, and this type of group. This shows cross-sectional. At one moment, we have all these different groups that we're viewing some type of trend in. Longitudinal is a different kind of way. This is when we look at the same group over different periods of time. So it could be like the same twins over 15, 20 years. Correlational study versus experimental. These are some ways to kind of remember. Correlational is we identify relationships, so we're just looking for those trends, but we're observing naturally. We're not manipulating, or we're not involved. We're not getting our hands dirty. We are just observing. There's no control. We're not looking for cause and effect. We're just collecting data. Naturalistic observation, this is when we look at people or different animals in their natural environment without being seen. We're staying out of their way. We want to see their natural, true behavior. Going back here just to show you experimental, we're looking at that cause and effects. Now, unlike correlational, we are manipulating things, the independent variable. We're using control groups and random assignments. We're doing random sampling, and we're looking for that yes or no answer. It's more controlled, more structured, so that's why it's cause and effect. Correlational, there's a lot of confounding variables, things that can mess the study up. So it's more of like a, hey, we see a trend or relationship, but we can't guarantee it. When it comes to variables and groups, here we go. We have a population, which if you look over here, is a full group of some sort of group of individuals. So for example, it could be the population of a country, population of a school, of a city, of a town. All of those are examples of population. Basically, everybody in that group of individuals. Now, what we do is we don't have time to interview everybody or put everybody in a study, so we take a sample. Think of it as a slice of pizza out of the entire cake. We can't interview 300 million people, but maybe we interview 10,000. That's a small chunk. And we want to do it the right way. We don't want to have any biases. So we have what's called random sampling, which means we randomly pick people for the study, and they all have an even chance to join the study. So we might go to different locations and just randomly pluck people. We're not going to sit there and pick certain people for studies. Random assignment means that once we have our group, our sample, we put them in either the control group or the experimental group. Typically, they do this randomly with like numbers or a blind picking game or something that doesn't have the experimenters directly kind of lean one way or another in the group picking. We have control groups, which are the normal groups. So these are the groups that are not manipulated, and experimental groups. This is the group that is manipulated in a study. So for example, the experimental group, if we're doing different types of liquids on plants and their growth, the experimental group would be like the weird liquids, things like Gatorade or iced tea or things like that. The control group is the normal one. So what would a plant normally have? Water. So water would be the control group. Now what we do is we want to see what happens with these different types of liquids, for example, and we look at the different variables involved. Independent variable is the thing that you directly are changing. In our case, it'd be the different liquids. We get to choose that. We get to control that. Dependent variable is the after effect that we're waiting to measure. We have to put the liquid in, and then we wait to measure the growth and the height. So the growth of the plants would be our dependent variable. Control groups are things you can control. So like, for example, maybe the climate, the temperature of the room. Maybe it could be the types of, the types of locations that you have these plants in, for example. All the things that you can do on your end to kind of keep it balanced and regulated are control variables. The pottery, the use of pots for the plants, for example, is another one that you can use for that. Confounding variables, these are things that can ruin or mess up your studies that you don't have control over. So for example, maybe a bad storm came by and actually ruined one of the plants. That's something out of your control, a confounding variable. Now, a few last-minute terms on this one is representative sampling, which means that your population should look like your sample, and vice versa. So, for example, if we're looking at teaching jobs, or let's go to high school students, like the different grades, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. If you're taking a sample of all high school students, you should have freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors in your study. That represents the population. Convenient sample means that you're probably going to choose people that are available and close to you. So for example, if I'm doing a study on high school, I'll probably pick a school that's within my neighborhood versus flying kids out from Alaska to be in my study. It's convenient that way. Now, another important term that you do need to know is generalizability. Generalizability is the idea that what groups are impacted in this study based on the participants that were used. So does this impact certain groups as a generalized finding? So for example, if I'm using a study that uses males and females of adulthood who have diabetes, the study is generalized with adults with diabetes. But it wouldn't be generalized for people not used in the study. So maybe people who, are children who have diabetes. That wasn't used in the study, so it's not generalized for that. Elderly, maybe the study only did 20 to 50. What about 90-year-olds? That's a group that is not generalized in the study. Then we have a lot of biases we have to kind of get through. We have experimenter's bias, which means that researchers unintentionally influence a participant's answer. So they might nod while they're answering yes or no questions, or they might make a face that will change the participant's answer on accident. Sampling bias means our sample doesn't represent the population. Going back to what we kind of talked about, that freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, this would be if you don't use freshmen and juniors in your study. It doesn't look like our representation of the population. Social desirability bias, which is choosing socially acceptable answers. You're going to answer in ways that, if somebody else read it from society, you'd want them to be like, oh, this person's like good. This is not like a weird person or a strange person. So maybe it talks about like murder, for example, or frustration or aggression. You might avoid certain answers because you feel like society-wise, you don't want people to put this label on you. Self-report bias is kind of similar. This is when we kind of answer biasly about ourselves on surveys. We might make ourselves look better than we are, or we might over-dramatize things as well on there. Directionality problems means that correlation doesn't cause causation, and it also means that we don't know sometimes with relationships which came first. Does academic achievement cause interest, or does interest in a subject cause academic achievement? We don't know which one causes what. We just know that there's some type of relationship involved. Now, a few ways that we kind of prevent some of these problems are with placebo. So we use like a fake version of like a medicine to trick people in the control group to think they're getting the same treatments as the experimental group. Going back, one is the third variable problem. This means that sometimes if there's a relationship between two things, it might actually be a third thing that's causing this fake relationship, this illusionary relationship. So for example, maybe with the interest in the academic achievements, the amount of time studying is that third factor when it came to that caused this fake relationship. Double-blind studies are when the researchers and the participants don't know who's in what group. That prevents bias. They treat each group the exact same without worrying about them, changing their tone or questions for one group over another. Structured interviews means that you have fixed questions with mostly simple yes or no responses. You keep it unbiased. You keep it simple. You can use it for data. It's one of the most common ways they use interviews. Statistics. We have histograms and scatter plots as graphs. Histograms, as on the right here, shows the amount of something. So these are shoe sizes. So for example, this shows that for size 8 shoes, there's about 31 of them. For size 6 shoes, what is that, about 3 right there? Maybe size 10 shoes, we're going all the way up to like almost 34. So we can look as a bar graph at the amount of something. This one being shoe size, maybe it's A's, B's, C's, and D's, and F's in a class. These are all different examples of histograms showing the amount of something. Scatter plots, they kind of look at directionality, so like the direction of relationships. So they look like a bunch of little dots. And basically, if they go upwards, that means it's a positive relationship. If they go downwards, it's a negative relationship. And if they just go all over the place, there's no relationship. This is a way to show that if, for example, one variable goes up, the other one does as well. That's positive. If one variable goes up and the other goes down, opposite directions, it'd be negative. But if they don't have any movement with each other, that's just no relation. Now here's some of the math that you do have to know. You need to know what mean is, which is the average score. You add all the numbers up, divide by the amount of numbers. Boom, you get your answer, all done. Median is the number in the middle. You gotta put your numbers in lowest to highest first, and then you kind of check off one by one on the sides until you get one number left in the middle. Now if you have two numbers, that's okay. Don't freak out, don't panic. You just get the mean of it. You add the two numbers, divide by 2, boom. There's your new median. And you only do that if there's two numbers in the middle. Mode is the most popular in seed numbers. So if you see 2 8 times in a data set, and that's the highest amount of number that you see, then 2 would be your mode. Another way to look at that is on the histogram, the highest bar graph. So for example, I believe this one would be 10 and 9. Going back to that, those would be your modes because it's the highest amount of something, highest frequency. Since these are the same, you can't really do that, but yeah, so it's basically the most common number that you can find. Range, we're looking at the spread of data, so this means kind of the highest number compared to the lowest and all the numbers in between. So for example, you take the highest number subtracted by the smallest, and that's the range of all the different data set numbers that you can kind of put in there. So if it's 100 minus 2, the answer would be 98. Going back to this kind of shows us our type of graphs. Positive goes up, negative goes down, no correlation, doesn't go any direction. Skews, to kind of talk about those real quick. These are kind of the changes of some of our data. Best way to identify these is if it looks normal and kind of symmetrical, there's no skew going on. There's no lean. I like to look at the word skew as lean. For this one, which is a negative left skew, we look at the long tail, the wispy kind of long tail. This is like a sheer drop. We're looking where that long tail is going. And since this is going left, it's going left and negative because it's going left on the number line. On the right side, the long tail's over here, so it goes positive right. When it comes to peaks, these are pretty easy. You shouldn't get any of these wrong. Unimodal is one hill. Bimodal, like a bicycle, has 2 hills, like 2 tires. And multimodal means multiple hills. They might throw one at you like that on the AP exam, but this is the best way to kind of look at it. Practice examples we talked about in class. Some other statistics you need to know. Standard deviation is the next one. This is the kind of average variability between scores and the disbursement of them on a graph. What that means is like the range of the different kind of scores that you can find on a graph of your data. So a high standard deviation means that there's high variability and a wide spread. So for example, a lot of people scored, different from each other, and the range of all the scores really goes an expansive way. But a low standard of deviation is the opposite. This means a lot of people scored very similar together. They have less variability. They're a little bit more consistent when it comes to their scores. So for example, up here, we'll look at this little graph for a second. A standard deviation of 5 versus 10. The 10 is wide and expansive, right? It's bigger than the 5, so you can see that it expands out far. Scores between 90 to 10%. That's a lot of different variations of scores. Now the purple one is about half the standard deviation. It's about half the distance, right? Scores between 30 and 70. Now the scores are a little bit smaller, but they're more consistent. They have a higher amount. Correlational coefficient is the number version of those graphs that we saw right here. So this is the number version of these. So correlational coefficients is a number between -1 and 1. And if it's a positive number, it's a positive graph, a positive relationship. A negative number is a negative inverse relationship, meaning one goes up, the other goes down. If the number is 0, there's no relationship, of course. But another thing you need to know is how far away from 0 matters. So it's between -1 and 1, but if it's a 0.02, that's pretty weak. If you think about it as a percentage, that's about 2%, a weak relationship. But if it's -0.75, that's a 75% number. That's pretty strong. So anything above 50, which is 0.5 on there, it's pretty strong either way when it comes to that. Statistical significance, p-value, is typically on AP Psych is p is less than 0.05. That just means that if you get a p-value that's less than 0.05, your study is true and it's significantly statistical. But if it's above 0.05 or 0.05, that means your study might be a little too high on the chance or luck side. So you want to keep that kind of margin for error less than 0.05. Null hypothesis means that your hypothesis is wrong. You reject that when you want to say that it's right. Weird way to put it, but that's how they use it. Percentile rank means it's the percent that you are better than or as good as on some type of score or test. So for example, if you score in the 85th percentile, that means you've scored better or as good as 85% of the people who took that same test. Effect size means how much meaningfully does a relationship actually impact the real world. So for example, maybe a medicine makes you gain weight, and statistically it does, but it's only 0.1 pound. So that on an effect is pretty small. But if you're trying to lose weight and you get a number of like 25 pounds, statistically that's also significant. And the effect is huge, it's a lot larger. So effect size is how much it actually matters in the real world. Now we have regression towards the mean. What this means is over time, weird numbers that are really high or low tend to fall back to their average over time. Let's say you typically get a C in a class and you get 3 zeros in a row. Typically over time, you'll kind of slowly make your way back to that C, and vice versa. Maybe you aced 4 exams in a row. Most of the time, people kind of fall back to their average. Gambler's fallacy is the idea that the more you gamble, the different the odds are, and like rolling dice or flipping a coin, the more you do it, the odds and the chance changes. That's not true. We know that flipping a coin is always 50-50, but if you see heads 5 times in a row, you might think the chance of tails is higher, when in reality, it's still 50-50. All right, ethics, and we're done. The APA, which is American Psychological Association, they determine a lot of the ethic laws and the overall rules for research. The IRB handles a lot more of the small-scale research ideas from companies and colleges and schools. The Animal Care and Use Committee, they make sure that the U.S. are following guidelines for different animal usages in studies. And a confederate, which we talked about, are when actors who are a part of an experiment. Typically, you can see this on like the What Would You Do shows and stuff like that. Anybody who's in or an actor on the, like an accomplice on the experiments, is a confederate. You gotta know these for the AP exam. These are the 7 different ethical guidelines that you have to follow in psychology. The first one is informed consent. People must agree to be in your study. You shouldn't bribe them with money. You shouldn't force them. They should agree. If the person is a child, they have to get informed assent, which means that they have to get approval from themselves and a parent. Number 2 is deception. Try not to lie unless you absolutely have to, and you have to debrief them, which means go over it at the end of the experiment. So you can't just lie and never tell them. You do have to wind up telling them after the experiment is over. Debriefing, going to that one, is after the experiment, you have to discuss those lies if they were there and ask them questions or answer anything that they have on their end and make sure there's no negative effect long term. Speaking of negative effects, protect from harm physically and mentally. They shouldn't come out with any trauma or disorders, and they should be physically fine in one piece, obviously. Confidentiality means keep their personal information protected unless they're told before the study. Right to withdrawal means that they can leave at any point of the study. And given advice means don't give professional advice unless you are qualified to give so. So that's everything when it comes to the ethical laws. And that's the entire Unit 0. Hopefully this kind of helped you go over some terms. Use this video as a way to kind of reflect and go over specific ones. And yeah, hopefully this was useful for you to get ready for those exams. Good luck with Unit 0 research methods.